Dear colleagues, welcome to today's ValEUs lecture series, European values as perceived from Central Asia. My name is David Orlov. I am a PhD candidate in Eurasian Studies, and I will be moderating today's discussion of the article titled "Nobody Goes to Another Monastery with Their Own Charter: The Youth Promotion of European Values as Perceived in Central Asia," presented by Dr. Zhanibek Arynov. Dr. Arynov is an assistant professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy at Nazarbayev University in Astana, Kazakhstan. His research interests include Central Asian geopolitics and security, EU-Central Asia bilateral relations, international identity, image and perception studies, and Kazakhstan's foreign policy. The event is organized by the Jean Monnet Policy Network ValEUs, Research and Education Network on Contestations to EU Foreign Policy, in cooperation with the Viadrina University Institute for European Studies. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available via the ValEUs YouTube channel. By attending, you agree to be recorded. Zhanibek, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for this introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. So we are hosting this, I don't want to say lecture, but this small talk about European values as part of the ValEUs Project, which brings together more than 15 universities from across the globe, from the EU countries, from North America, and Nazarbayev University is part of the ValEUs Consortium as well. My name is Zhanibek Arynov. For those whom I don't know, I'm based at Nazarbayev University, currently at the visiting professor at the National University of Singapore, and my previous research has been extensively on EU Central Asia relations, including on perceptions of the EU, different aspects of EU policies in the region. So today's talk I would like to base on one of the papers that I published back 3 years ago. So probably I would like to say that most of the findings from that paper hold valid and today, I guess, despite that the data was collected about 7-8 years ago. But of course, on top of that, there are some developments, recent developments, both within the EU at the global level and also in Central Asia that may add some kind of discussion to EU Central Asia relations, also the perceptions of the so-called European values. So the topic is European values as perceived from Central Asia. So I would like to talk for about 25-30 minutes, and then we're going to have about 30 minutes for Q&A. So if I'm speaking too much for David, please just stop me at some point, maybe. So when we talk about Central Asia, for those who are coming from who may not be familiar with the region, so when we talk about Central Asia, we mean politically 5 countries of the former Soviet Union: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. So this is the political understanding of what Central Asia is. Of course, culturally, historically, Central Asia is bigger than these 5 countries. But in the context of international politics, we refer to these 5 countries. So they share the same, more or less similar historical background, cultural background. There are some differences, but still, for the most part of their history, they've been living together, interacting a lot. So in that sense, culturally, historically, also in terms of identity, in terms of language, lots of commonalities between these 5 countries. They got independence in 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So for the most part, Central Asian countries are described as authoritarian countries of different degrees, while Kyrgyzstan being the least authoritarian, I would say, for the most part of the independence. Kazakhstan being also semi-authoritarian, classified as semi-authoritarian. Historically, Turkmenistan being one of the hardest countries with hardest political regime probably in the world. So in that sense, we're talking about these kinds of political regimes for the most part with weak economic developments, right? In terms of foreign policy, Most of the countries in the region apply the so-called multi-vector foreign policy, trying to balance between different kinds of actors, including Russia being one of the most influential actors politically in the region, and also China, the EU, Turkey, US, of course, and then others. So in that sense, the balancing between them has been the main foreign policy approach for most countries in the region, except probably for Turkmenistan, which formally adopts the policy of positive neutrality, meaning that we don't become part of any regional institutions. So when it comes to the EU, just a short history of the development of EU Central Asia relations. So we talk about different phases, different periods of EU Central Asia engagement. In the very initial stage, when these countries got independence in the 90s, the EU was still going through these internal transformations, the Maastricht Treaty, 1992, the enlargements, and so on and so forth. And then also for the most of the EU countries, Central Asia was still a very distant kind of region, because they had most of the Western European countries were interested in the transformations, political economic transformations in the Eastern European, Southern Eastern European countries. Then Russia was more important for the EU, Belarus and Ukraine. So in that sense, Central Asia wasn't visible in the sense in EU's foreign policy, or in foreign policy of many European countries. Despite that, there were certain projects like TASIS, Traseka, Inogate, a kind of extension of what the EU initially designed for Russia, Ukraine, and then they were automatically expanded to cover Central Asia as well. However, things started changing early 2000s when Central Asia has become highly securitized because of this global war on terrorism, the Afghanistan, then Iraq invasion of some US-led the forces. Some EU member states were part of the coalition as well. So in that sense, Central Asian countries sharing border with Afghanistan have become a bit more important and visible in EU's kind of foreign policy. Some of the European member states had military facilities in the region, not necessarily military bases, but logistical centers, including Germany, for instance. And then in that sense, Central Asia acquired a bit kind of significance for the EU. But later in the mid-2000s, we saw this an energy crisis, energy disputes between Russia and Ukraine affecting the EU's energy security. So essentially, some of the Central Asian countries are rich in terms of oil and gas resources. So in that sense, that was another kind of pillar of EU's interest, energy, hydrocarbons from the region, lots of huge plans, but most of them didn't materialize, especially when it comes to gas exports from Central Asia to the European market. Then EU's second the enlargement in 2004, the biggest enlargement that brought Central Asia closer physically to the European borders. So in that kind of context, the EU adopts its first foreign strategy for Central Asia in 2007. It was a kind of formal strategy with lots of ambitious goals in different kinds of fields. However, in terms of, and then of course the EU's presence increased quite significantly. The EU opened several delegations almost in all countries in the region except for Turkmenistan. It came a bit later. Then investments were coming to the region. However, EU was still a bit kind of second tier player in Central Asia. So then, by inertia in 2019, there was a new iteration of this EU strategy for Central Asia. So some people may say that this was a new kind of phase in EU Central Asia's kind of interactions. However, when we talk about the second strategy in 2019, we mostly talk about continuity. So not many things changed compared to the first strategy. Yeah, the wordings were a bit different. The emphasis was on resilience and so on and so forth. But however, when it comes to the substance, Central Asia was becoming maybe a bit even less interesting for the EU, because EU's interest, security interests in Afghanistan were also waning. But however, today we may hear a lot that the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, created a new momentum for EU Central Asia relations. So it has become quite a buzzword for those who work on EU Central Asia relations, but still there are lots of discussions about green energy, critical raw materials from Central Asia to EU countries, transportation routes, the Middle Corridor, and so on and so forth. Just last week, Uzbekistan hosted the first ever summit at the highest level between EU and Central Asian presidents. And then again, lots of diplomatic announcements, statements, plans, promises. But again, these things require political will and also economic investments to materialize. So we shall see how this will be changing in recent years. But at least at the diplomatic, symbolic level, the contacts have intensified since 2022 war. So in this kind of context, the EU Central Asia interactions, so what is the role for EU's norm promotion, right? So that's one of the important points for both EU and different non-governmental actors, both in EU member states, also in Central Asia. So normally, the governments in Central Asia are not much interested in, talking about norms promotion. Sometimes they criticize highly the EU's insistence, or the EU's, especially European Parliament, is active in that sense with tons of resolutions regarding democracy and human rights issues in Central Asian countries. However, the EU itself also gets criticized a lot for its compromise of norms of human rights and democracy in favor of interests, right? So it didn't start yesterday. So this kind of criticism towards the EU has been, has had kind of long track since probably early 2000s. So norms promotion has been on EU's agenda from the very beginning. So in the 90s, the main focus was on democratic transition of these countries, as well as transition to market economy. So most of the TASIS programs were designed to help Central Asian countries for this kind of transitions from the political perspective, as well as to the market economy. But later in early 2000s, the security interest, energy interests, as some criticize the EU, kind of compromised the EU's insistence on norms promotion. So now it continues up until today, even following the summit that I mentioned last week. Some commentators have also criticized EU for not putting much emphasis on norms, democracy, human rights during the summit. And also we see that there is internal clash within, I don't want to say clash, but some kind of internally different approaches between different European institutions, plus between different EU member states, right? So countries like Italy, for instance, they have quite a significant, including France, for instance, quite a significant energy interests in the region. They don't speak much when it comes to norms promotion, while some Nordic countries, the countries from the Baltics, the state kind of region, they tend to emphasize this norms component more than others. There is also this kind of disagreement sometimes between European Parliament and European Commission. European Parliament being more harsh in terms of rhetoric when it comes to norms promotion on Central Asian countries, while European Commission adopting more kind of this principled pragmatism approach when you try to find this pragmatic ground to not to push too much on norms, at the same time mentioning it repeatedly through different kinds of statements, and also funding some kinds of NGOs in the region. So this is general context. So in that kind of context, the question was back years ago when we started this project, okay, we talk about the EU's norms promotion, but what do Central Asians think about European values, right? What do they think about the European norms? Because back then, that was mid 2010s, there was hugely expanding literature on European foreign policy, kind of trying to move away from the EU-centric assessment of EU's foreign policy. That was also kind of related to Central Asia, because most of the literature up until today, maybe, for the most part, are EU-centric. So what the EU does, how it does it, how it does the things on the ground, with what effect. So those are the main concerns, while on the literature on EU Central Asia, kind of the literature from Central Asian perspective on EU Central Asia relations was scarred back years ago. So in that kind of decentering EU studies kind of framework, we started also asking these questions. Okay, if EU talks about European values, those values to be accepted, they must be viewed also as legitimate on the ground. So in that sense, how do people and different actors in Central Asian context perceive European values, how they interpret European values? So that was our main kind of aim. So the paper was published back 2022, but as I mentioned, most of the things that I'm discussed in the paper still remain relevant. So I will talk about this in a moment. So methodologically, in this particular paper, we focused on intermediate elites, so-called intermediate elites. They kind of serve as a link between high-level decision makers and the wider public. So we're talking here about parliament members, mid-level bureaucrats, experts, scholars, journalists, NGOs, and so on and so forth. So again, it was done for different reasons. If later there are questions about the methodology part, we can expand. So we based this study on in Kazakhstan on the 53 interviews with different kinds of stakeholders at this interview level. So based on the analysis of this qualitative paper, qualitative data, we came up with some kind of interesting findings. So then we treated in this paper European values as an empty signifier, right? So we didn't specifically define what we mean by European values. We rather wanted to understand what the participants perceived European values to be. So while analyzing the data, we identified that the concept of European values is interpreted from two kind of angles. One angle is political, the other angle is cultural. So the combination of this political interpretation and cultural interpretation of European values allows us to identify three different ideal type perceivers of European values in Central Asian countries. So this looks like this. So you combine cultural values and political values, and then you get these three categories. So the first category, I call them ardent supporters who support both cultural European values, who view positively both cultural values and political values. Then we have moderate supporters, so-called, who admire European political values, at the same time have certain reservations against cultural values as they see them. And then we have opponents who deny the suitability of both political and cultural values as they see them. So when it comes to the content of what this different types of supporters articulate about European values. So we, for instance, for ardent supporters, I mean, they agree that European values are universal. So this is the kind of mantra that EU itself repeats all the times, that we're not talking about European values, rather we're talking about universal values. So in that sense, the first category of perceivers, ardent supporters, accept that kind of claim. At the same time, in the context of Kazakhstan, these ardent supporters do not support the state narrative, which is quite visible in the context of Kazakhstan, that each country may have its own unique model of democracy, right? So that has served as a kind of justification for sometimes for non-compliance with democracy and human rights in the context of Central Asian countries. So these ardent supporters deny that kind of argumentation. Also, they deny that based on cultural kind of contextual background. Different countries may have this cultural relativism kind of argument that, well, we are different culturally. So in that sense, those values that the EU members have, I mean, they deny this as well. So in that sense, what they argue when it comes to the EU's promotion of European values, they argue that those values need to be adopted by Kazakhstan. So in that sense, they fully support what the EU does in terms of promoting these values and supporting NGOs, local NGOs. In that sense, ardent supporters have full support, express full support towards the EU normative agenda. So this is just one quote from many. So for instance, one respondent said that there is only one model of democracy. Each country cannot make its own model because a country is either democratic or not. The same as a woman is either pregnant or not. So this is a direct quotation from one of the participants, right? Then we had the second group that we discuss is the so-called moderate supporters, right? So this group, the category of perceivers of European values, on the one hand, they argue that European political values, meaning that democracy, freedom of speech, free elections, I don't know, human rights, they are universal. In that sense, when the government of Kazakhstan says that we cannot adopt that kind of models from other European countries, they deny again that one. At the same time, they heavily emphasize on cultural relativism kind of argument, right? So saying that, okay, yeah, these values are important, but at the same time, there can be some cultural differences between different kinds of societies. In that sense, those values that the EU promotes need to be adapted rather than fully adopted, right? So we need some kinds of filters to make sure that we filter out certain elements that don't fit the local cultural kind of context, right? So one example is, for instance, they support generally the most of the people who belong to this category, they support that the human rights are important. They have positive attitudes towards human rights. At the same time, for instance, the rights of sexual minorities are excluded from this universal human rights kind of category, right? And also they emphasize that the societies in Asia, in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan are more kind of not individualistic like in European countries, as we live as a sociums and society bonds, family bonds are more important. In that sense, we cannot have that kind of democracy that most of the European countries have when they emphasize the rights of individuals. They put the rights of individuals above the interests of society. So this kind of differences, which are explained by cultural kind of differences, make them to adopt, to support some of the values that they see legitimate, at the same time to reject some of the values that they see that culturally inappropriate in the context of the country. So again, one quote from one of the participants: some of the European values are clear and close to us. If rule of law, we definitely should aspire to it, but what does the concept of law include? Law for whom? If for gays, we cannot accept that. Then we have the opponents of whatever normative kind of whatever norms are promoted by external actors, right? So for them, anyone coming to the country and kind of trying to promote different kinds of norms is something unacceptable because of the perceived threat to the political stability, as well as to the perceived threat to local values, traditional values. So in that sense, what they say is that, okay, any kind of promotion of values, including European values, must be rejected by the country. Yeah? So adopted, adapted, and now the rejected. So probably this kind of view mostly fits the state narrative to a certain extent in the country, which tries kind of sometimes to emphasize that the Kazakhs as an ethnic group had this nomadic steppe democracy, and then yeah, we embrace that kind of the democracy. So we don't need any kind of democracy, European democracy, because we historically had that kind of nomadic democracy. So, for instance, this quote is illustrative of this position. So, one of the problems of the EU is that they believe that they have developed a universal model of development for the entire globe. They are deeply mistaken in this. The world is diverse. Each nation, each country has its own differences, traditions, culture. They, Europeans, should take this into account, but not stubbornly impose their model. We were electing our Khans when there still was the Inquisition in Europe. So again, you see lots of references to this uniqueness, the cultural kind of differences, non-universality of European values, and as well as this kind of some kind of historical. So we argue that at the end, we argue that these three categories serve as a kind of ideotypical categories of perceivers of European values in the context of this paper in Kazakhstan, but from my personal observations in other countries of the region, probably, I mean, again, I'm a bit cautious here, but probably we can also extend this to the context of Russia. So for the most part, most of the perceivers in the countries, Central Asian countries, seem to fall under one of these categories when it comes to the perceptions of European values. So there are different explanations, of course, potential explanations. What kind of factors shape this kind of perceptions? Of course, one is the Russia factor. So we discuss it in the paper. So Russia's media, Russia's narratives, kind of trying to delegitimize the promotion of democracy, values, whatever, by Western countries. I mean, also influence the perceivers in Central Asia. Why? Because Russia's media is quite influential in the Central Asian context. So Russia factor at the international level, Russia factor is one. Second of all, it's more recent, I guess. So in some inconsistencies in EU policies also create lots of questions here. One example is, again, the EU's approach towards the Palestine issue over the last 1.5 to 2 years, which has sparked quite intensive discussions in most of the Central Asian countries. So the argument goes that the EU is not doing much, enough to support the rights of the Palestinians. And then in that sense, where is this Europe moral kind of moralizator in Russian sometimes, kind of trying to serve as a moral authority, accusing Central Asian countries or other countries of the violations of human rights. But usually when Israel does that, I mean, it doesn't do enough. So that kind of thing in EU's, that kind of differences in EU's approaches also create certain kind of distrust towards the EU. Also, there are domestic level factors, of course, the political context one. So when you talk to this intermediate level elites, so you see sometimes this the state narratives traveling through the conversation, right? So popping up again. In some cases, probably they genuinely believe in those narratives. In other cases, maybe that kind of narrative is just serving as a general political context, political background. A cultural context, again, we cautiously hypothesize that probably, again, those coming from more Kazakh kind of dominating contexts within the country, they may have more reservations against European values compared to those. Again, I mean, we haven't tested this with representative data, but our assumption is that probably we see the divide between the Kazakh speaking and maybe kind of the Russian speaking, or urban or rural, if you wish, kind of the context, the cultural context in the country. And also we kind of observed that the affiliation with the state sometimes makes people a bit kind of, at least when they articulate what they think about European values, those who are affiliated with the state tended to be more critical of the EU in that sense, kind of mirroring the state narratives. On the other hand, those coming from the oppositional background, oppositional parties, oppositional leaders, NGOs critical of the government, they tend to be kind of siding more towards the supporting the European values, or having kind of positive attitudes towards European values. So again, we haven't tested any of these factors quantitatively in this paper, but again, I think there is kind of much more to do. So probably, yeah, in one of the projects in coming years, we will be doing some additional stuff with some quantitative data. So because the quantitative data is a bit kind of problem in Central Asia context, but yeah, but this is one possibility for us. So what does it mean? So now, I mean, again, the paper was published back 3 years ago, but still, I think the importance of the relevance of these values, the norm promotion, external norm promotion, has become even more salient in the context of Kazakhstan in recent years, right? So what we say is that Kazakhstan had internal protests back in 2022, and after that there were some promises for political liberalization in the country, but for the most part the reforms were rather cosmetic rather than kind of fundamental. So in that sense, there was some kind of rhetoric that we need to democratize the liberalize certain kind of aspects of our political life. However, in practice, these things never materialized. But in recent years, there was another trend observed in most of the Central Asian countries, including Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, even Georgia, the recent developments in Georgia. So now from the state narratives, we hear more and more that norms promotions or support of local NGOs by external actors need to be somehow regulated. Then Georgia, for instance, adopted this foreign agents law. Kazakhstan doesn't have a law, but there is a huge discussion about this currently in the context of President Trump closing down USAID. So these discussions are there, and now we see. I mean, it seems to me that the personal observation that the Central Asian governments have become more vocal in recent months, or maybe over the last kind of few months, more vocal in terms of rejecting any kind of external promotion of norms. So kind of the support, external support towards local NGOs and so on and so forth. So again, probably this Trump effect has also played a role. And then the EU is also having some internal issues. For instance, this recent ruling against Marine Le Pen was also kind of was perceived by some as a kind of controversial kind of thing. So this kind of EU internal discussions plus internal political developments in Central Asian countries and wider geopolitical context makes the norm promotion even more difficult for European member states. So probably that's one of the reasons why, again, last week when during the summit, there was so little emphasis on democracy, human rights, norms in general, and then for that the EU just have been criticized a lot. So I'll probably stop here. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. So generally, this is how the EU or European values, more specifically, are discussed in the context of Central Asian countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhanibek. Thank you very much for the insightful presentation of your study. I had a chance to read it and recommend it to everyone else.